Research itself, and this is the one that I highlighted because in my scope of work, we refer to this all the time. Research is really systematic investigation, and this is quite wordy, but each of these parts of the definition do become quite important. Systematic investigation designed to develop generalizable knowledge. And generalizable just means something that you can take beyond the scope of the practice and the setting that you're in. Oftentimes it gets confused with quality improvement. Quality improvement is generally, and again, this is maybe an overgeneralization, but generally used to improve practice or care in the institution or setting that you're in. Research oftentimes, in distinction, is the intent to make that more broadly applicable. Clinical trial is a subset of clinical research. As you see here, and I'm not going to read it for you, I think has more of a emphasis on the intervention, and whether that be drug or device or procedure, anything diagnostic or therapeutic. And we'll talk about some examples of that in a little bit. This slide I used in a different presentation, so I'm sorry if it doesn't quite fit here, but healthcare research in general is quite broad. There are many disciplines. Add to this list physical therapy, PA work, medical, nursing, etc. Here is the distinction that I started making verbally earlier. Basic science is more in the lab. Translational research is moving ideas from bench to bedside. Maybe a little bit of a cliche there, but really moving it from the lab, from the petri dish, from drug and device development to the clinic, to clinical research at the bedside. And then subsets of that, you can run into all the different physical specialty areas too. So in types of clinical research, there are a number of different categories, and I admit this list is not exhaustive. You yourselves could probably add another half dozen to the bottom here, but I think some main categories that we see are therapeutic is probably one of the biggest ones. That can be broken down into drug, device, procedure, even other ones. The definition of a drug is an article that's intended for the use in the diagnosis, cure, treatment, prevention of disease, and intended to affect the structure or function of the body. So you can imagine through that the FDA probably can see a whole variety of different substances that are classified as drugs. Some examples I listed there, dabigatran is a up-and-coming anticoagulant. Device studies, a device in distinction from a drug is that same definition, but which does not achieve its primary intended purpose through chemical action in the body. So some examples of devices, as you see on the screen there, can range anywhere from a tongue depressor or a crutch all the way through a very invasive total hip or another device. Procedures too can, sometimes they want to compare two different ways of doing things in the operating room or in the clinic. Labs and scans as well are not necessarily an area that we think about a lot as involving clinical research, but there's one study that we're working on right now that's using different sequences in the MRI because of the potential for that to have an effect on the health and safety of patients. That as well is deemed clinical research, something that needs to go through the IRB, and is an example of clinical research too. Biospecimens, that field has really become more and more prominent, I think especially after the mapping of the human genome, but is quite prevalent now too in some different contexts. So perhaps patients are consented if they're going into a different procedure anyways where some tissue may be removed. If they give consent, We may obtain a small specimen of tissue that's going to be otherwise removed or is quite benign or not very harmful for them in the context of their procedure, and can study that tissue and do some research on that tissue and use the context of some of their clinical data to inform that work too. Cost effectiveness in retrospective, some could argue that that's not necessarily under the scope of clinical research, but sometimes you may come across that too. Some things that really push and drive clinical research. There are quite a few. One, right off the bat, I think the most obvious one is the patients that we work with. That's really why we do the work that we do, driving the science and trying to improve care for all of them. There may be intellectual interests. There may be scientific endeavors that you as a researcher or a different scientist may be interested in investigating too. The government may stimulate that by different funding agreements. Economics itself, as we'll talk about in just a moment, there's a huge cost behind clinical research. So anytime money is involved, that can be a large driver too. You may have heard of thalidomide disaster in the late 1950s. There was an antiemetic drug that was supposed to be given to pregnant mothers to help out with nausea. And I think 10 to 20,000 different babies had pretty bad birth defects. And since then, it's been researched more for uses in multiple myeloma, for example. So tragedy can really stimulate more research as well. The Supermab disaster was more recent, I think in 2006. In London, there was a drug intended to treat leukemia and rheumatoid arthritis, but it caused fairly bad systemic organ failure in 6 healthy volunteers. So after it's gone through some preclinical work, pre-humans, it's been shown to be moderately safe and effective in animals, for example. To have something like that happen in the context of first-in-human trials is kind of scary and can prompt some more research. And then publications, career, obtaining grants, maybe tied in a little bit with number 2 and number 3, but that can push for additional research too. I want to just take a brief moment here to talk about the costs of clinical research. I think this is quite important. Over the last few years, the number has gone up from 0.7 billion up to $1.3 billion to take a drug from concept to market. And very, very few drugs actually stay viable through that whole process. It's incredible how many fall off along that continuum. And it takes approximately 17 years for drugs to go through that preclinical through FDA approval type phase. So just to give, my mind, for example, does not comprehend numbers outside of the thousands and millions. So 1.3 billion. Okay, so you have a 2012 Lexus sport luxury car. How many of those equal this? 32,000 of them. Brand new house in today's dollars, the median new house, 6,500 of them. Single dollar bills stacked this way, not end to end, 63 miles. So that's up to space. That's from here this way to Lansing or south of Kalamazoo. It's a lot of money. So you can just imagine how much that really drives industry and how much that drives scientists to find a drug that really works. And that drives up our healthcare costs too. I mean, this has a ripple effect throughout the industry. Approximately 75% of funding for clinical research is from the federal government. And yet, even talking about those numbers, research for better drugs, better devices, better procedures is still less than 6% of our healthcare spending. So let's get to the meat of why we're here. What does it take to do clinical research? What might a job in clinical research look like? So in general, the types of people that we look for and who are often successful in this type of role are good project managers. They know how to be organized, know how to communicate, they know how to take projects from start to finish, and work within a team quite well too. There's a lot of working with data. It's not all data, it's not all sitting at a desk working with a spreadsheet, but there is quite a bit of that, as we'll see in a couple moments too. And working with quite a few new technologies, and we'll talk about that briefly with some case report forms in a slide or two here. So in preparing for clinical research, these are some of the examples of specific activities that we might find ourselves engaged in. And I want to be clear that this is more the role of a research associate, a research coordinator, a research nurse, and we'll talk about some of those career options in a few moments too. But this is really the project manager in charge of the study. This is what the people on the teams that I work with at Spectrum Health do. So they may help out with the operational design of the study. What does it take to really make this study work? And in knowing what goes on in routine clinical care can be very advantageous here, because if a study can be designed to mirror routine clinical care, you can imagine how much smoother that must make the implementation of the study, not only on the different stakeholders involved, but then also when it comes to insurance reimbursement. If we can make a 2-month post-procedure MRI match routine care, that MRI may be able to be billed to insurance as opposed to being a cost of the research study. So we just tag on to that and use the data from that. That's one example. We work with drafting the informed consent form, drafting the protocol or certain pieces of it, drafting the case report forms. That's really the data collection forms. Doing feasibility and merit analyses. And what that means is looking at the slew of projects that are presented to an organization and evaluating them. Does this make sense for our organization strategically? Does it align with our mission and vision? Does it make sense scientifically? Is this really the next best study? Is it going to contribute to the literature? Is this going to provide novel therapy alternatives for our patients? And then looking at the operations of it. Do we have the capacity to really make this work? Looking at the finances of it. Is this thing going to put us underwater financially? And if so, is that worth it relative to the scientific and strategic value? Financial coverage analysis, referring back briefly to what I said about whether something can be applied to insurance, or whether or not the research study needs to pay for that. That's quite an in-depth, detailed analysis, and I won't bore you with those details right now. Working with the budget and contract, whether that's with a federal grant, or working with an industry sponsor, or working with an internal partner, maybe a physician who works for the hospital or university that you work in, to make sure that those are negotiated well. Facilitating the document through the IRB, or the Institutional Review Board, that really looks to protect the rights and the welfare of the human subjects. And then also, in preparation for implementing something like this, going out and having conversations with the physicians, with the department staff, all the stakeholders who may be affected by the research study. So then once it's gone through all of that preparatory work, and we can talk more about that offline if you have more specific questions there, what does it take to get this going? Screening patients. There can be eligibility criteria that are as simple as anybody that's coming in for a CT of the abdomen without contrast. Easy enough. Anybody that comes in, approach them for involvement in the study. There are other very intensive chemotherapy agent trials, for example, that could have 10+ pages worth of inclusion and exclusion criteria to make sure that patients really fit to be in this trial. And if they're not, you can imagine how that has an effect on the data in the output. More education to patients and families as you explain to them what the trial involves. And then if they're interested at that point too, having the consent discussion with them. perhaps being involved in administering the drug to them, or being involved in the operating room as they get a new device or a procedure is evaluated. Patient assessment and adverse event evaluation is maybe more on the clinical research nurse portion or somebody that has a clinical background, but there may be patient assessments involved there too. Collecting data. In ECRFs is electronic case report forms. You'll find that acronyms are all over the place in clinical research. So case report forms, again, are where we collect the data. And quite a few of those nowadays are electronic, so we don't have to do the paper version, copy that in triplicate and send it out to everybody. It's right on the web. Doing follow-up visits with some of these patients. And for some of these trials, they can go on for 10 years or even until the patient expires if they're survival studies. So it can go on for quite a while. And good opportunity there to establish and maintain some nice relationships with our patients. A lot of tracking, and there's good computer software that can help us with that. Monitoring and query resolution refers to when somebody from the sponsor, well, let's just use an industry example. Let's say we're doing a device study with Medtronic. They will either send one of their representatives to us or contract with a third party to come and monitor our data to make sure that the data that we put in there really is verified in what we call source documents or in the electronic health record, just to make sure that that data is clean for them. Where does clinical research happen? Hospitals are a natural source, so to speak, of having patients, but you can imagine how many scientists do clinical research in a university setting. And some academic medical centers have their own patients in that context. Other universities partner with hospitals to have access to patients there too. Industry, only in partnership with the other two, will have an opportunity to work with clinical patients. This group right here is the group that I primarily work with. And I think this is probably the heart of what many of you are thinking about. What does a career in clinical research look like? Being a clinical research assistant or associate or coordinator or research nurse really goes back to those few slides that I talked about with the activities in clinical research. Many of them are associates through master's prepared. I'd say the vast majority are bachelor's prepared. Experience can be anywhere from 0 to 5 years. And I've listed the salary range here too. And I'm going to run through 7 of these quite quickly. But do want to point out too that this is from my research online. This is not representative of what our pay is at Spectrum Health or whatever opportunities there are there either. Clinical research leadership, I think, has an application for all of you too, because I started out as a clinical research nurse and worked in that for a couple of years, and now I'm in clinical research leadership. I think a certificate program like the one that Martina is going to speak about in a few moments really equips clinical research nurses, coordinators, associates to be able to move into research leadership positions too. So, before all of you think, oh, I want to make $500,000 a year, what I mean by that is there are dean positions, vice president positions, institutional official type positions that often include the MD, PhD, even combination, and salaries may go up there. Briefly now on a few of these, research pharmacists. We have one dedicated to research at Spectrum Health, and they help to compound the drugs, to look at tracking and accountability. You want to make sure that something that's an investigational product isn't by accident taken off a shelf and given to a patient in the normal clinical routine. Bioinformatics and statistics, this is something that I was just speaking with Dr. Allrod before the presentation, and maybe he can speak to that a little bit later too. Large opportunities for working with data, and you can imagine the impact of statistics on the design and analysis of a study on the back end. In the power analysis, for example, if you need 20 patients to get statistical significance or clinical significance in a project. You don't want to quadruple the cost by having 4 times that many patients involved. This is a very broad slide here, but there is a place for people with backgrounds in finance and law, in grants and compliance. In the background preparations for those can vary quite drastically. If you're interested in that, we can talk a little bit afterward. Investigators are primarily those with terminal degrees. Most of the ones that we work with in clinical research have their doctorate in medicine. Some of them do as a PhD, and many of them have a combination, PhD, MD. And the IRB I spoke about briefly earlier, there's really a human research protection program to make sure that the rights and welfare of patients are protected in clinical research. And IRBs can need to have representation from the community. So that's why I put how much it varies, because people from the community may get a small stipend for sitting on the IRB. And there has to be scientific members there as well, so they could get their compensation there related to their other degree. So that's where we really lead into preparation. How do we get there? What do we do? If I'm interested in clinical research, how can I get there? And these are some of the certifications that somebody can get. If you have questions on specifics, I have what all of these mean, and we can talk about that, but those are not required either. I shared with you briefly how I got into it. I'm a nurse by training, but we have other people come in with a Bachelor of Science with a very different focus and have an interest in research, and they've been some of the most successful people on our team too. So there's quite a few different ways to get into clinical research. Certifications like this and the certificate program that Dr. Reinhold can speak to in a moment are good ways to prepare yourself for a career in clinical research.